An old woman in her mid-60s sat before me, her eyes constantly shifting to the dusted art that speckled her walls. Everything about the place felt old and withered, reflecting my host. The majority of the paintings that hung were Renaissance-esque, most of them depicting elegant humans in the nude being murdered in some way or another. I leaned back in my chair, glancing down at the lined notebook I had brought, which bore bullet points stating questions and conversational topics. I slid the book away from myself and let my eyes pan back up to the woman. She was thin, her dark curly hair bearing streaks of white and grey towards its root. Her skin was a deep tan and yet also possessed a see-through quality. Her eyes were a consuming blue. I cleared my throat quietly, grabbing her attention. "So, Miss Warren, is there anything on your mind before we begin the interview?" The woman pursed her lips before speaking.
"There is always something in mind, my dear. Just too far to reach and too much to remember. I have nothing to contribute to the silence. You may begin."
A small plastic smirk wrinkled across her face with the conclusion of her permission. "Well, I suppose you know why I'm here. I'm sure hundreds of journalists have asked you the same question. But how did you get to that place?" I snatched a pencil from my pocket and placed it gently against the paper of the notebook in anticipation.
"Oh, of course. Well, let's see. I suppose it all started like a normal day. I was in my late 20s, bordering 30. I worked as my husband's occasional assistant."
I took a moment to glance at her ring finger, which was desolate of jewellery. She continued.
"He was a scientist attempting to unlock the secret to time travel, and I suppose in a way he did."
She trailed off for a moment, her eyes glazed and glided to the floor. "Ma'am," I said, once again drawing her attention back to the interview.
"Sorry, my dear. What was I on about? Oh, yes, forgive me, my husband. Anyways, one day he calls me in an uncharacteristically excited and urgent tone. He tells me he's made a big step toward time travel and he wants me to come see it. So I hang up and head over to the lab. Once I get there, he ushers me in and presents a large contraption. The machine resembled a door frame, but had many moving gears and shifting bits protruding. There were long, thick wires of glowing fluid leading off of it and into tanks bearing hazardous signs. I was speechless and didn't even have enough time to think before he presented me with a proposition.
"Ethel, I want you to be the first adult we send through."
I found myself scanning the room as a result from my disbelief. Across from his grand contraption sat many cages covered in tarps. Small noises radiated out, like secrets. "John, what's in the cages?" I asked. It was a simple question, or so I'd assumed, until his face contorted. He let out a crooked cough to clear his throat and hide a deeper sorrow. I could see it in his eyes. He could barely bring himself to recall whatever lay hidden. "John," I prodded. He looked at his feet in a childlike manner.
"Darling, you know I would never let anything bad happen to you, right?"
I nodded in recognition of his question. After a brief minute, he shuffled over to the cages and stared through me.
"Ethel, I have created a portal to some other place, which I believe to be the distant future. We started by sending animals through, but upon their return they were twisted, vile things who bore no resemblance to their original structures. Rats came back with flesh and bone showing, but additionally something beyond caused them to fully mutate. They now looked as if they'd transformed into some demonic representation of their former compositions, with extra bones, limbs, sensory organs."
John hesitated before reaching under the tarp and pulling out a small cage. Inside sat a creature with an exposed skull and rib cage, reddened by bare muscle that replaced its skin. The bones around its paws had extended through the flesh and became claw-like. It had 2 extra sets of jaws with just enough muscular tissue to hold them together, and many more ribs than it should have possessed, all of which protruded out like spikes. Its organs were all encased below its ribs in a thin, translucent sac. On top of its twitching skull shifted dozens of small eyes, all visibly connected to its brain with squirming tendrils, the brain of which sat partially exposed at the back of the head, encased in its own see-through sac. I stumbled away from the cage, a hand swiftly coming up to cover my mouth in exasperated expression. John returned the rat to the tarp upon witnessing my condition. "What else have you sent through, John?" I beckoned with a trembling tone. John's eyes darted to the tarp.
Dogs, cats.
There was a sudden sense of fear and immense sadness to his voice, which heightened in his final statement.
Children? Most didn't come back alive at first.
At this point, silent tears streamed down John's face while he tried his best to justify his work.
But I was so determined. I kept shifting equations, changing the door's dimensional outputs. When we had finally succeeded in bringing an unmutated child back, they were so traumatized from what they had seen that they took their own life. Ethel, I need you to go through because you are the most strong-willed woman I have ever known. If anybody has a chance of coming back, unfazed, it's you.
I passed a box of tissues to the old woman, who had began incorporating pauses into her story, filling those gaps with sniffles and sobs. I tried my best to be empathetic. "Miss Warren, do you want to take a break?" I asked in my most sincere tone. She nodded in agreement.
"I'll make tea,"
she said with a shaking jaw, before wandering off to the kitchen. I closed my journal and took a deep breath, attempting to process all I had learned this far. I looked to the painting above the table I sat at, which only then did I seem to recognise. In oversized dimensions, encapsulated in an intricate black frame, loomed what I assumed to be a copy of Saturn Devouring His Sun by Francisco Goya.